Thanks. Well, you've covered off nicely the order of service, so I'm not going to speak for very long. In reflecting on this, I thought about if you've read accounts of the 1930s, young people in the 1930s going to university or whatever were either communists or fascists. No one believed democracy, right? And someone growing up in the 50s and 60s, that was always quite puzzling. And I now kind of understand a little bit more of that era, because it seems to me democracy is under challenge, because both fascism kind of lost its kind of luster in the with World War II, and communism went out of fashion big time. And so democracy was kind of the only game in town for a while, but it's kind of losing its luster. So I think we're really lucky to have Bryce Edwards, who's going to talk to us about democracy, age of turbulence, and the meaning of life.
Yep, indeed, double D. No, Mr. Speaker. Well, they said they just turned the switches on. Are they going? They're not going. I tried.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Derek. So Derek asked me along to talk about the state of politics, and I was particularly interested to talk about the state of democracy. And putting together this presentation over the last day or so, the elephant in the room was the fact that we have so much volatility at the moment in politics. There's been a tumultuous time in parliamentary politics, lots of scandals going on. And I kind of want to just unpack that and try and find some meaning, try and understand why we're having more leadership changes, resignations, dismissals, and general volatility and focus on scandal. So the question is our democracy becoming dirtied? Is it a decline, having all this focus on politician wrongdoing? Are our politicians becoming less ethical? Are we spending too much focus, having too much focus on exposés? Is there too much focus on the leadership of political parties? And so what does all this mean? Okay, so there's no doubt about it in my mind that this has been an extraordinary time in politics. We live in interesting times internationally and locally. And the turbulence we've seen, I think, illustrates some of the strengths and weaknesses of New Zealand politics and the political system. We saw an opinion poll come out last night. News Hub had this poll out, and I think it illustrated the sense that we've had an effective government. So this is one of the pros of our political system. We've had a very effective government that has dealt well with this shock, this pandemic, and they're being rewarded for it. Labor's at 61% in the opinion polls. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. You have to go back to 1987 when Labor was last at 61%. Likewise, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is being rewarded. 62% of the population prefer her as Prime Minister, and 85% say that she's performing well as Prime Minister. These are remarkable figures, which I think do represent that sense of stability. So it's not all about instability. And I know Derek might come up with some counterpoints at the end of all this to show that even though we're having lots of fluctuation and things, there's some endurance. There's some sense that we have a two-party system essentially at the moment. We're not having some of the revolts we see in some of the other countries. So it's not all negative, and it's not all chaotic. In fact, we regularly have international surveys, analytical results that show that comparatively we're a very democratic country. So The Economist is one of the most robust versions of trying to work out to what extent different countries are democratic. And the most recent one that came out in January had New Zealand as the 4th most democratic nation on earth. So they gave us a ranking or a rating of 9.29 out of 10. And they said we have the best civil liberties in the world. Transparency International comes out every January with their corruption perception index. New Zealand was #1, the least corrupt country on earth. There's lots of other surveys to show that we have a very good functioning political system. However, there's been some concerning changes, I think, this year in parliamentary politics. Especially over the last few weeks, we've had what seems to be an opposition in shambles, imploding. We seem to have some questionable ethics of lots of parliamentarians. And we have a lot of scandal. And this is something that's actually been happening a lot over the last term, parliamentary term. This year was supposed to be a big policy debate. We have an election. That's the wonderful thing about elections. It's a chance to think about where the country is going and what the different visions are from the different political parties and politicians for structuring the economy, for structuring all the things about society. This one was predicted to be, the most policy-focused election of all time because of the pandemic we're just coming out of, because of the economic recession we're going into, where there's going to be mass unemployment, where there's going to be further business failures. It's going to sharpen the minds. That doesn't seem to have happened. Instead, we haven't had a lot of focus on manifestos and policy. So there's questions about if we have this focus on personalities, on individuals, on wrongdoing, is this making politics dirty? Is it going to turn people off? When we have some focus on the tawdriness of what some MPs do, is it going to make our voter turnout even lower and push people away and reduce their trust in politics? And therefore, are we just generally focusing too much on scandals at the expense of maybe more important, meaningful debates? Okay, so putting this presentation together today, I tried to come up with a list of some of the more important, or at least the more visible scandals that have been happening over this parliamentary term. Jamie Lee Ross, his departure from National must have been one of the biggest scandals we've seen in parliamentary politics. Leaving with all those allegations about corruption in the party he was leaving behind. With all the sex scandals, all the tawdriness. We've had lots of other political finance scandals, not involving individuals so much, but involving how political parties fundraise their money, and they've led to questions questioning our corruption-free status, questioning to what extent vested interests might be buying influence in political parties for policy. We've had a number of dismissals from the current government. We've had Mika Whatere dismissed over allegations of violence, Claire Curran over opaque meetings she held, David Clark over the way he dealt with COVID-19 responsibilities. We've had other MPs and other ministers in trouble, such as Chris Barfoy, when he promised to fast-track a friend's visa application. And then, of course, this year we've had we've had 4 leaders of the National Party over this term, 3 of them in this 1 year. Simon Bridges, of course, at the start of the year, replaced by Todd Muller, and then after a few weeks, replaced by Judith Collins. We've had 2 National MPs resign in disgrace over quite, tawdry and dishonourable things that they did. And of course, we've had lots of retirements from the National Party. As Lynn was saying before we came on, 18 retirements at this election from the National Party. There's a sense of churn, of change, of turmoil. And of course, in the last week, we've seen a cabinet minister dismissed by the Prime Minister for having an affair, which again is a new landmark in terms of where politics is going. So in my mind, we have some sort of increased volatility. No, it's not the same volatility that we might see in the US or some other countries where there's more chaos. But compared to New Zealand political history, we're seeing more change than we would normally expect. Obviously, a global pandemic has a big impact. So that's one of the reasons, and it's one of the obvious ones. Politics has changed everywhere, and I think it will lead to significant change for some time yet. So really what I want to look at over the next few slides is this idea that there's some sort of escalation of scandal politics, escalation of volatility. But first, I think it's worth reminding us that this has been what's happening in recent years. This isn't the first year to do where this isn't the first election that this has happened in. And so I went back and looked, I've used a few cartoons here to keep it light. I went back and looked at 2008. Lots of scandal back then. This was at the end of the Helen Clark government. And as we see in this cartoon, you've got Pete Hodgson searching for dirt on John Key. That was Labour's big way of trying to prevent a John Key government coming in. There were lots of allegations about New Zealand First, about, remember the no sign that Winston Peters held up, about donations that they'd received, which they had received, and of course New Zealand First went out of power at that election. It seems to have some big parallels with this time around. The 2014 and 17 elections, I think, also had a huge amount of controversy and colourfulness and scandal. And of course, yeah, the big one from 2014 was Dirty Politics. The Nicky Hager book came out with these explosive allegations about the way that the Beehive was operating, about this idea that the Beehive, or John Key's office, the Prime Minister's office, was taking its negative stories, its aggressive attack stories, and parceling them off to a rather rabid blogger, Cameron Slater. And so I looked back at 2014 and looked at some of the cartoons from that time, and they seemed oddly reminiscent of some of the things we're seeing at the moment. This idea of toxicity coming out of the political system. This was about the Dirty Politics book. These were some of the headlines, some of the front page stories that came out in the days after Nicky Hager published his book. So you can see some other themes there of leaking, of National really being in some trouble. They didn't do badly in that election, of course. So that's something we might come back to soon, about whether any of this has a big impact. Do people care about these scandals? And there was a feeling back in 2014 that this was all tawdry. This was all a distraction from policy, from ideological debates, from the real issues that we should be discussing in an election. And again, I can't help thinking that there'll be a lot of people thinking similarly this time around. People asking, can we have our election back? Can we get back to talking about manifestos, about the policy differences between the political parties? Whoops. And this idea that maybe some political parties are throwing scandal out, that maybe this is the new weapon of electoral competition, this idea of scandal mongering. And perhaps it all just leads to chaos with infighting amongst the politicians. Does this really serve the public interest? So I quite like this cartoon. It's a beautiful oil painting with some sort of warfare and going on, and the person in the gallery looking at it says, they say this painting was inspired by the 2014 general election in New Zealand. I think you could probably have that cartoon again in 2020. Okay, so in my mind the question is, what's happening? Yes, there's always been scandal in politics in New Zealand, and it has been increasing in recent elections. But I think there's some long-term changes that are happening in the base and the foundation of politics that are allowing this to happen. In my mind, political parties have become unanchored. They're floating on a sea in a harbour. They used to have moorings. Those moorings have been cut, and so in some ways they're floating around in a dangerous and sometimes liberating way. Things are much more flux than they used to be. And this is good and bad for politics. It's good to have change, but too much change, too much unstructured change, I think can be rather dangerous. Okay, so one of my first long-term trends that I think we need to understand as a foundation for increased debate about scandal politics is the fact that we're having a more hollow democracy. We do have that robust democracy and one of the best ones in the world, but it's undermined by lack of participation. On just about every metric you can think of in terms of measuring participation, it's been going steadily down over the last 50 years. So voter turnout obviously is the top level of participation. And this chart doesn't go far enough back, but in the 50s, 60s, New Zealand used to have one of the highest levels of turnout in the world, over 90% of eligible voters. By the time of 2014, this had reduced to 69.4%. So this is the grey line here. It hit below 70%. So this isn't of enrolled voters, this is of eligible voters. You can measure turnout in different ways. It bounced back up at the last election to about 74%. But still we're talking about 1 million eligible voters choosing not to vote, choosing not to participate. And of course, there's a variety of ways, of reasons why they're choosing not to participate. I think we can all discuss or have our own theories about what will happen at this year's election. Will it get worse or better? Okay, the other main way that people participate in parliamentary politics is by joining political parties. And so I've done some research over the years about membership of political parties. And again, New Zealand used to have one of the highest participation rates in the Western world. We were the highest in the OECD. Our membership rate was about 24%. So nearly 1 in 4 eligible voters joined Labour or National back in the 50s and 60s. Now it's plummeted to about 2%. So about 1 in 50 people join political parties. And in my mind, this has some profound effects on the way our political system operates. That old mass membership style did have it cohered politics. It kept political parties and politicians, MPs, engaged with civil society. The fact that you had branch meetings, you had some sort of ways for people to organically influence what their politicians were doing, I think changed the way those politicians operated. It changed the way those political parties operated. Now, of course, the political parties are cadre parties. They are elite parties. There's not really a very strong active membership. Okay, one of the other big ways that I think politics has changed, that has produced greater volatility and scandal, is the fact that society's structural connection with political parties has changed. So traditionally, the party of the left, Labour in this case, was very much structured or based on the votes of working class, of the urban working people, National, the other side of the coin, professionals, provincial people, farmers. And that structured politics in a way that kept things very stable. It meant that there was very strong party identification. So once you started voting Labour, you tended to vote Labour for the rest of your life, and likewise National. There was some variation, but there weren't huge changes. People actually, when they voted for national, they called themselves a national voter. That isn't so much the case anymore. People might say, I'm voting national this year, but I voted Labour last time. And they changed their mind a lot more. I'm not saying this is better or worse, but it does have implications. So at the start of this year, I actually go back to 2017, and you could see how this can dramatically change the fortunes of political parties. There's a change of leadership from Andrew Little to Jacinda Ardern. They go up in the polls from 24% up to 37%, almost overnight, with just a change of leader. Likewise this year, National was at 46% in the polls in February, and they've plummeted now to what we saw last night of 25%. This never used to happen in New Zealand politics, not those dramatic shifts in a short period of time, because those ties used to be stronger between parts of society and parts of the party system. In my mind, there's been a professionalisation of politics in this country. It goes hand in hand with the decline of those mass membership parties. The politicians themselves, the leaders of the political parties, they operate quite independently of those memberships. They don't really have that base in society that they used to. And increasingly, the types of people that go into politics have changed. In the past, it was quite common for someone to go into the Labour and National Party after a long career in, say, teaching or farming or being a trade unionist or whatever, depending on the type of political party. It was something that you'd go in as a vocation, something because you felt strongly about changing the world or helping the country. These days, politics is a career. We're seeing people get elected at a much earlier age, and often they're not having careers out in the private sector, civil society, so much as in the spheres that are related to politics. So it's increasingly common for MPs to first have an apprenticeship, if you like, in what you might call the political class, in the media, in local government, and increasingly common working in Parliament as a political researcher, speechwriter, etc. And so in my mind, it changes the whole way that our representatives think about why they're in politics. It's a career like elsewhere. And they tend to be more skilled because of that, especially in the art of communications, especially in the art of organising things. But arguably, it's at the cost of some idealism. Arguably, it's at the cost of being there because of ideological reasons. Sometimes it just means that MPs, especially in safe seats, have a fiefdom. They don't have a large party membership that's structuring their behaviour. They're there as individuals. And I think it does lead to overconfidence or arrogance. It does lead to what we're seeing quite often of politicians thinking they can do what they want. And it's a lucrative career, as we know. And increasingly, the remuneration for MPs is well out of step for what the average New Zealander makes. Whereas in the past, there was some sort of parallel with a teacher's salary. Now, of course, backbench MPs are on $165 as their base salary. The Prime Minister's on nearly $500,000 a year, and a bit less for other cabinet ministers. So this chart here, you don't have to look at too much of the detail, but it's a look at the occupational backgrounds of our parliaments over the last about 8 parliamentary terms. And it's just interesting to look at some of the changes. What we're seeing, if I'd sum it up, is that we're having a more middle-class parliament. And people are coming from professions into parliament more than ever before. We're We're having fewer teachers, we're having more lawyers, more managers, more people from local government, fewer trade unionists, no manual workers, of course. So in a sense, we often talk about how our parliament's improving in its diversity. It's improving, it's becoming younger, it's becoming more female, it's becoming browner, but it's also becoming more middle class and more narrow in a socio-economic sense. And again, I think that's part of that professionalisation of politics. So what happens when the political parties lose their strong ties with certain social groups in society? When National's less of the Farmers' Party and less of the party of business, and Labour's less of the party of workers, they become more centrist and they become less ideologically distinct, and they have to find other ways of differentiating themselves. If you can't fight over very different policies that they're projecting, very different worldviews, you end up having to project other elements that you think will win over people. Often it's about leadership. Often it's about the qualities of the personalities involved. And so we're seeing this throughout the world. We're seeing a focus more on the presidentialization of politics. We're seeing an attempt to sell politics or politicians as being competent, as being likable, and having all the skills that we want for governing. It's not so much about ideology. And of course, it's the natural inclination for politics or politicians and parties to try and do the reverse for their opponents, to try and erode ideas that their opponents have integrity. If you can show that your opponent party is in some ways fundraising in a corrupt way, if you can show that there's some dirt on the personality of your opponent, this is your fastest way of winning elections, of at least getting a head start over them. So that natural tendency to start weaponizing issues around personality, leadership, ethics, and bring scandal into politics, it's limited though. There's some sort of countervailing issues that stop this from happening, in my mind, or there has been traditionally. So, for example, there's always been in New Zealand a culture whereby the private lives of politicians is off the record. It's not for the media to report on, it's not for debate in the, allegations in the debating chamber. Those things are off limits, traditionally. All this has been changing, and like I said, politicians can now see that there's some electoral gain, and so they're gnawing away at some of those changes. And so again, here's just a couple of cartoons that I've taken from the early 2000s, where politicians have started talking about those private lives. So again, this is Phil Goff bringing up some National Party or national minister back in about 2010, and you can see the glee. And again, I think this could be a cartoon from 2020 as well. When we saw Don Brash as the leader of the National Party, increasingly there was a lot of rumour mongering in Parliament about whether he was setting on affairs. Again, this was new territory that we haven't been used to in New Zealand politics. So in the past, there's been one particularly strong culture that has stopped the escalation of scandal. It's this idea of mutually assured destruction. This idea that you don't throw a weapon against your opponent. Labour or National don't throw allegations about the other side being corrupt. They don't throw allegations about the sex lives of their opponents because they know those weapons will be thrown back at them. They know that they have wrongdoing, or at least the perception of it, on their own side. And so it's meant that, there's been this nuclear detente, if you like. so occasionally these, scandal politics does come onto the agenda, and the parties do start fighting over it, but they soon de-escalate things. I think we're at that stage at the moment in New Zealand politics about whether the parties are going to come back from the brink, pull back from fighting over the ethics of their opponents, or whether they're going to be digging up more dirt and passing it on to journalists, etc. And so it was quite interesting back in 2013 when John Key was Prime Minister. He talked quite overtly about this. He talked overtly in this quote here about how he kept being informed of what Labour MPs were alleged to have been doing, their wrongdoing. And he had written it down and he kept it in his top drawer. And then in 2014, he said this in Parliament, I have quite a long list. This is when National were being accused of certain things by Labour. I have quite a long list. If Labour members really want to invite me to table all of those things, they are welcome to do that. But I just want to make one little warning to them. Do not go there. But if you want to, I'm more than happy to do so. So again, that threat of mutually assured destruction. And they did, they pulled back. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens in the next 2 months of this election campaign. Okay, I'm getting towards the end here, but I'll kind of wind things up. But there have been some other important changes, I think, in society that's led to scandal being more central this year, at least in politics. Changing social mores, changing ways that the media operate. Media has no doubt got more aggressive, more tenacious in trying to uncover wrongdoing. Changes in social media has been, in some ways, democratising. Any citizen can now share information widely. And we can email those in authorities. Our ability to be whistleblowers, essentially, has been accelerated quite considerably. And there's a greater openness, I think, in society to exposing wrongdoing. Things that could be suppressed in the past can no longer be suppressed. And there's heightened sensitivities, especially with the Me Too movement, about wrongdoing in terms of power relations and sexual harassment. So some of those changes, I think, are also feeding into what we're seeing with this propensity towards scandal and volatility. Okay, I won't go over this one too much, but I'll just sum it up by saying we're seeing a lot of survey evidence that people have lost faith in politics. They've lost faith in Parliament, in authority, and elites in general. And again, this is giving a greater openness to having those elites, if you like, critiqued. And I think it's also leading to some of those changes, well, reduction in participation. Who wants to join a political party? Who wants to be associated with politicians when no one really respects them? So I think we're now in a situation where there's a danger of, or maybe it's a good thing, that we're moving towards scandal fatigue, where, yes, we want to watch that train wreck. We want to, some of this is highly engaging, it's colourful, but we will at some stage probably say enough. We want our policy debates back. We want to know what the political parties stand for. But there's also a risk, I think, of our heightened concerns about wrongdoing, about ethics, and making us immobilised. It can have a very conservatising impact. If people are so worried about bias, so worried about openly being political, and I see this in the public service, people are scared to be outspoken. People are scared to be political. The politicians are becoming more risk averse. Every press release now has to go through the leader's office. They can't speak for themselves because of things being interpreted in the wrong way. Like I said, I think there's a risk that the public themselves are going to have a lower opinion of the pursuit of politics and of those involved. Okay, but there's no doubt about it. In my mind, this is the new normal, what we're seeing this year. It's not an aberration. I've lost my notes. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, scandal politics is good and bad. Depends, it's a subjective thing. In some ways, it's very democratizing. In some ways, it is allowing people to see what goes on behind the scenes. Exposing wrongdoing, exposing corruption, exposing some of those things, I think does make for a better society. But of course, we have to have some balance. If everything becomes about those scandals, about ethics of politicians, then I think we do lose as a democracy. We have to also become better, and I think the media and politicians themselves have to become better at working out the difference between what the public's interested in and what's in the public interest. And of course, not all scandals are equivalent. Not all downfalls are the equivalent. So again, we need to be able to have public conversations about whether politicians should be sacked if they have affairs. Is that the same as a political finance contribution or many of the other things? They're not all equivalent. We need to get more sophisticated, more nuanced in our discussion of our different controversies. Okay, so yeah, in the end, perhaps we need better scandals, more quality scandals. So that's my last plea. And oh, sorry, that was my last slide. I got a bit mixed up. So I've made those points. In the end, I think it'll be a real shame if what we're seeing from this turmoil, this scandal politics, leads to fewer people being involved in politics, fewer people going into Parliament or wanting to go into Parliament, fewer people joining political parties, fewer people voting. Politics, in the end, democracy really has to be about participation. So that would be the shame of things. Okay, and just on my last slide, I'll just give a quick advertisement for something I'm involved in at the moment, which is called the Democracy Project. So it's a new sort of think tank that I'm doing at the Victoria University of Wellington. It's independent of the university, but it's hosted there. We've got a new website called democracyproject.nz. We have a number of services that we do. One is an email we put out Monday to Friday, 8 AM, which is a compendium of everything that's happening in politics. It's a link to all the stories, everything that's been published on New Zealand politics, categorised into the different areas such as health, education, labour, national, etc. So we're trying to kind of raise that quality of debate and information to make democracy a bit better. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Bryce. That was fantastic, very rich. There is, of course, I imagine, quite a spectrum of views within this club as to the different issues that you were talking about. I have to say, the idea that we should have better quality scandals is one which intrigues me. I'm not quite sure what a better quality scandal would be, but anyway, somebody may want to ask about that. Can I also say something which I should have said before, which is to welcome people on Zoom, because one of the byproducts of COVID, there aren't many good ones, but one of the good ones is that we now have the ability quite easily, thanks to Joy, to be able to have people coming in on Zoom who wouldn't otherwise be able to come here physically. So welcome to those who have come that way. But I'll open the floor now to questions. And as I said earlier, Bryce is very willing to answer almost any question, and from whatever part of the political spectrum it comes from. So,
or you can just disagree and put your own opinion.
Yeah.
I'm interested.
So, yes.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. The veracity of the poll which has come out, so it opened about 2 days after Judith got the leadership and it closed last Friday. So I didn't understand what sort of poll that was. It wasn't like 1,000 people like AC Nielsen. It was open for quite a while. So can you explain?
Okay, so this is, the question is about the News Hub poll that came out last night at 6 o'clock. It was carried out by Reed Research, which is a very robust polling company. I believe the polling period was this, I think it was the 16th to the 26th. So it, from memory, so it did start I'm not sure what the period was actually, but it was over the time that Judith Collins was the leader. And it went, I think, most importantly, over the Andrew Falloon scandal, over that period, which in my view, that's why it went so, National went down so low. People were heavily turned off by that. But of course, we do have rogue polls. And so National's been arguing today that this is one of them. It's not in line with their own polling, and that's quite possible. Polling isn't a science. They do get it wrong. And 1 in 20 of these polls will be quite wrong. So it's certainly possible. And the results were quite extreme. So it does make it look like a rogue poll. 61%, we've never seen anything like that since 1987. But we do live in extraordinary times. And that turmoil that was happening in National, I think, was off-putting. People lost their confidence in the party. And then when you've got, MPs like Andrew Falloon doing what he was doing, I think people did find that disgusting. So it turned them off, and I think that was unfortunate for National. But it was also broadly in line with some other polls that had, generally Labour going up and National going down. So I think it is believable, but no, I think it could be a rogue poll. What's unfortunate, I think, for National also about that poll is that we have the bandwagon effect often in politics, whereby people see polls and especially for floating voters, swing voters, they see that as a guide to how to vote. And so they're influenced by it. They think, well, 61% think Labour's the best option. That's what I should do too. And so I think it's going to be very hard for National to come back from such a devastating poll like that because it changes the narrative. So I thought National might still have some chance of getting back, but I think that's dwindling after that poll, just because of that influence it has. Hi.
Bryce, what would be your criteria for a better quality scandal?
I don't think that I have any better criteria than anyone else here. They're very subjective things. I personally think political finance scandals are the most important ones because they really speak to this idea of the resources in politics and how the political parties get them, and they do raise questions on how those political parties operate. So I'm very interested to see what happens with the serious fraud investigation into New Zealand First and what that says. I'm much more interested in that than knowing any of the details about Ian Lees-Galloway's private life. But I know that that's subjective because a lot of other people will think what a political leader does in their private life speaks to their character and speaks to how they treat people and all those sort of things. I'm not going to say that that there's any rules about this. But you see what I mean? How the way that political parties operate, I think, and the ones that have less to do with personalities are the ones that interest me the most.
We'll start with Christine.
I was going to ask, what's your view on the attraction for women into Parliament in the current sort of scandal-ridden environment?
There's no doubt that every election sees an increased proportion of women standing for Parliament, and that fits in, and they're successful as well. The percentage of female MPs in the Parliament just keeps on going up. I think it will get to 50% before long. That's driven, or that's partly relating to heightened concerns about gender equality and oppression issues over recent decades. And there's a real attempt by the political parties. There's an honest attempt by all of them to try and get female representation. Some are doing better than others, but it's a conscious attempt to go out and get those people. And there's a lot of attractiveness about becoming a parliamentarian. As I said, you get paid very well. Some politicians have a harder job than others, but being a list MP, you get a lot, or any politician gets, you get to try and change the world. And if you've got things that you want to change, you paid for it. So I'm not sure if that's really answering your question, but maybe you can tell me, because I'm interested as well.
I was thinking a little bit more about the relative comfort and fit for aspiring women politicians. Do you feel that there's a change, or even a sense that women get themselves into less problems in these environments? You know, what is there any comment in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a highly sensitive area to go into. So you've got to be careful, but I think, yeah, like I said, I think the arena of politics is becoming much more. There's no doubt in the past that it was hard to be a female parliamentarian, and it was hard in lots of different ways. But you know, I look at the students that I'm teaching, and politics is becoming more feminized. There's much more females studying politics at university. And you know, when we had Jacinda Ardern come and talk to them, and we had Nikki Kay come and talk to them last year, you could see how a lot of young female students could tell that, you know, politics is a place for women, it's not just for men. And that made a big difference. And so I think the existence of Jacinda Ardern as Prime Minister, just as it did with Jenny Shipley and Helen Clark, I think does change consciousness and makes people want to be involved. Yeah, that might not traditionally have been involved.
Yes.
Just interested in your views. It seems to me from your graph and also my knowledge that the membership of political parties has certainly gone down since we've had MMP. And yet in the MMP environment, it seems to me that our democracy starts in the party system, because this is where you select the candidate and you prepare the list. And so there's so many people who now have actually walked away from being involved at that beginning level.
Yeah, so the point is that under MMP, parties have been given more roles. You know, we vote for the parties themselves, and you know, in some ways they're stronger than ever. Political parties have more control over our politics than ever before, but at the same time they're weaker in the sense of being hollowed out, in my view. And so that is a problem, absolutely. And it was MMP was supposed to improve that. You know, people thought, well, a lot of specialists said, well, because the parties will control who goes in on the list, people want to join them, the memberships will go up. It hasn't worked out like that at all. So yeah, and it's a huge problem. And it means that in some of the smaller parties in particular, you know, there's not really democratic processes for determining who the MP or who the candidates are. I'm not sure if that answers your question either, but it is. I think it's absolutely a problem. Yeah.
Right.
George.
With the concentration now in the polls between the two main parties, does that start to signify the demise of the alternative parties? Is their day overnumbered, and will they soon start to disappear?
Yes. So the role of minor parties was supposed to be more central under proportional representation. We were supposed to have a party system where we had lots of options, and it was supposed to be the end of the dominance of Labour and National. It's just incredible. You know, this year we've seen, or in the during this term at least, we've seen support for the two major parties completely collapse that of the minor parties. And so, you know, the Greens, yes, they're just above 5% in opinion polls, but yeah, basically we're back to a two-party system. And I think that's really sad. I think there are benefits from having lots of minor parties that can be niche, that can specialise in certain areas, that can, I mean, Labour and National, they have to be all things, all people, often. Whereas it's good to have parties like ACT that concentrate on a certain constituency with a certain ideology. It's good to have parties based on certain ethnicity, like the Murray Party. It's good to have, yeah, environmental parties or nationalist parties like New Zealand First. And so, yeah, I think it's a real shame. I'd still like to see some more changes in the party system. And you know, there's actually a possibility that both the Greens and New Zealand First will be out of Parliament at this coming election. And in some ways, I think it might be a good thing. It might allow a rebirth of minor parties. Because in my mind, the 5% threshold is a big problem. You know, we should be having new parties growing up all the time, but that is a natural barrier that stops the evolution of new parties, because it's just so hard to get to 5% when all the other major parties or the parties in Parliament have the resources and all the publicity. So yeah, at least if we end up with just Labour, National and ACT in this coming Parliament, there might be the chance for some new growth.
You might be able to answer this question, but in most people's careers, you start bottom, you reach the zenith, and then you start to go down the other side. One of the things I see about our present Parliament is that we have some enthusiastic and well-intentioned people coming up the ladder, you might say, and we've got a lot of also well-intentioned people descending the slide at the other side. But how do we get people at the zenith of their careers to really come into politics, the people that could really bring the experience and the drive, not the people up there at the end? We need the young people at the beginning. I call them young people, or the people that are coming up, but our Parliament misses out on the people that can really make a difference because they know what is going on.
No, I'm not sure I can answer that very easily. I'm probably out of sync with a lot of people in that I think we don't have enough older people in politics. Traditionally, our Parliament was full of, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds. Now it's monopolised by 40-something and 50-somethings. And we have obviously a lot more people in their 20s and 30s. Like I've said before, I think there's some dangers of moving too much to having youth in Parliament. It's good to have diversity, but we've really got a lack of, I'm just trying to remember, but the only MP, I think, over the age of 65 was Winston Peters. And he might be one of your examples of someone going downhill, but like I was suggesting before, you know, life experience does mean something in politics, I believe. And it's a shame that we kind of have this cult of youth and people are pushed on so quickly. I mean, the idea of, yeah, Nikki Kay, Paula Bennett, Amy Adams leaving politics after such a short amount of time, I think is a bit of a shame for National. Well, it's always good, yeah, as a comedian will tell you, it's always good to put the microphone down when you're on a high note and leave the stage. So maybe that's the case, yeah.
Well, on that episode, no.
Can I just ask
Yeah,
does your expertise run to what's happening in America?
No, I keep away from American politics. Ask everyone else.
Sorry, there's one more question over here.
I've got a question for you. It's a double barrel question. Do you think that the destruction of the media, or let's call it the degradation of the media here, has meant that a lot of our reporting lacks context? So we see statements made, but then there's no context put in the box, like maybe we get the New York Times, the Guardian, or something like that. And then the way that local media has been decapitated, so that regional, localized debate about councils and local, you know, national party type stuff is now missing. So therefore, maybe that's the reason why they're having problems, you know, with people joining parties and hearing their own local debate. Sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded question.
It is, and I guess I'd just say that I totally agree with you, but I really would emphasise the huge financial problems that the media is in. Like the bottom has fallen out of the media market, and they can't afford. It's a crisis. Yeah.
Okay. I hate to hark back in the past, but do you think maybe the taxpayers got to get used to the idea of having skin in the game? I mean, we used to have, as I recall, a really good, like, state system. You had, you know, your radio, television. It was all supporting one another.
Yeah.
And then it was kind of like,
I think that's where we're going with the media. We will have to see the state provide some sort of mechanism for financing journalism. There's there's problems with that too. And yes, it's good to have in my view, to have a state broadcaster, but if the media becomes too reliant on the state, that does bring other risks, I think. So, but it's hard to think of a better model or a more viable model at the moment. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for that question, because that was the one I was wanting to ask, which is about media. So that's very helpful. And thank you, Bryce, very much for your presentation. I think you've done what we wanted you to do, which is to both talk generally about what's happening in the political system, but also relate it very specifically to what's going to happen in 2 months' time. So people will draw their own conclusions from what you have said, and no doubt nobody will go away with their minds changed, but you never know, they may be broadened in terms of their understanding of what's happening in our society. So thank you very much indeed for that. Please join me in thanking our speakers.